Welcome everybody. My name is David Edick. Got a long-running background in the world of energy, commodities, the world of finance. Did some investment banking out of Moscow in the 90s. I've been involved in Russia stuff since 1990 across the country. I am actively involved to this day, networking broadly. I've been doing presentations on energy for about 15 years, mostly in person here in San Diego, but the pandemic has opened up some opportunities for us all. And earlier this year, I was asked to write a commentary about Russia and energy, and I thought I'd do something a little different and talk Russia and the global energy transition. And a small commentary of 800 words blew up into 20 pages, a nice paper and kind of a pre-PhD thesis. And it turns out, you know, Russia is much talked about and poorly understood. And that's a real challenge for the topic. So I really hope and pray and wish that you enter this program with an open mind. You'll get more out of it that way. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Okay. And we'll do the slideshow, please. All right. Well, again, I want to thank the Financial Executives Networking Group for the opportunity to do this program today. This summer was another in a 3-year sequence of big news out of Russia. Big fires, the melting, the story of the melting polar ice cap in the Arctic, the melting permafrost, big news in the West, big news in Russia as well, including a friend of mine in Yakutsk, in Sakha in East Siberia, where really these big fires were centered. People were very much affected by the air quality there, very much impacting health and all. It's a very complex background on these fires, but they are huge, they are real, and there's likely to be more of them coming. Global warming, climate change is firstly affecting the Arctic. Commonly these days, if the weather gets weird, it must be global warming or climate change. Well, not for everybody and far from all the time, but in the Arctic, it's definitely obvious that things have changed and continue to change. So in the popular world, it's been a big media story. Here in the West, we see the worst of the worst. It's been the history of global warming in Russian elite, if you will, has been, well, you know, if it gets warmer, that's better. Winter is the third, preparations for winter is the third rail of Russian politics. You don't mess with preparations for winter. A lot of it's urban mythology in this age of technology, but you know, people are one step removed from the countryside throughout Russia and are very sensitive to hard realities of life. However, when this report came out a couple years ago, it began very substantive changing at the highest levels in Russian economic and political elite. And that is the impact on the permafrost and the reality that most of Russia's long existing oil and gas infrastructure rests on what used to be a bedrock of permafrost, and that permafrost is beginning to melt, and the implications, the long run implications, are quite serious, far from academic. And a quick look at permafrost in Russia. The purple zone here is permanent permafrost, and then there are grades away from that. This is kind of left over, if you will, from the Ice Age. Most of this region was unglaciated, and it was cold, and the ground froze thousands of feet deep. And every summer it melts on the surface. In Sakha, Yakutia, it's common for temperatures to get into the 90s or even 100 degrees, and it's been that way for many decades, hundreds of years. But the weather has gotten weirder. Rain when it should be snowing. They still have wicked winter, let's be clear. But things have very much changed, and the melting has become much more substantial. The area over here on the left, Area 3 in particular, is where most of Russia's oil and gas resources and infrastructure is located. Although increasingly in the northern part of Area 5 and in the southern part of Area 6, significant oil and gas development is taking place, railways as well, urban centers. So I'm going to try to cover quite a bit of stuff here. I'm going to take you through some national polling data. We're going to take a look at things from Russian eyes for a change. Take a look at some indicators, some socioeconomic indicators, international agreements that we all know. But let's get the Russian side on this. Greenhouse gas emissions in Russia, the Russians' domestic energy profile. I'm going to take a particular look at electricity, a brief look at hydrogen, the hard reality of Europe's carbon border adjustment mechanism and how that'll affect Russia. But this is one of the big topics for global trade going forward. It's kind of it's the snake in the room, if you will. It's it's coming, it's quiet, and it's got very big implications for future relations between all the big trading countries of the world and the companies that inhabit that space. Also take a look at a bit about Russian industry's response to global warming and policies that affect them, and a quick conclusion. So for those that are new to the world of Russia, this is looking at a population map. Most of the population in Russia lives here on the left side in Western Russia, European Russia. If you draw a line north from the Caspian Sea to the Arctic, that's roughly the Ural Mountains. There's about 25-30 million people that live east of the Ural Mountains, all the way over to the Pacific Ocean here. This is Japan here on the far right. My roots, not my roots, but my access point into Russia most of the time these last 30 years has been through Vladivostok, Russia, which is the same latitude as Portland, Oregon. And Vladivostok is a southern city within the Russian framework, if you will. Most of it's well to the north. Most of Russia is uninhabited. It is an enormous place, even for Americans or Canadians. The scale of the place is unimaginable. You have to see it to believe it. You have to see it to understand it. And when you get to things about infrastructure and all costs, scale of geography becomes important very, very quickly. Again, most of the people in Russia live in the West. So unfortunately, the reality is that within Russia today, it's an open society in an awful lot of ways. Politics are not so open, but everything else is surprisingly open. And Levada Center is a first-rate, highly professional polling and survey organization. They do commercial work for companies. They want to do advertising, and they do a lot of political and socio related polling. So you get polling work from Levada. It's first rate. And there was a poll that was done, published in January of 2020, just before the pandemic blew up. And in your opinion, which of the following global threats that humanity could face in the 21st century, what are the most dangerous? And 48% said environmental pollution. International terrorism was second. Armed conflict and wars was third. It's a big issue for Russians. climate change, global warming is fourth. Digging down into that polling further, for Russians back in 2010 on to 2019, the number, what's the most serious for Russia as a whole? What's the most serious environmental problem? Air pollution. Air pollution. Disposal of household waste, nuclear waste, resource depletion, genetic modified foods, water pollution, and then climate change is pretty down the list. What environmental problems affect you and your family? Air pollution, water pollution, GMO, and again, changing the climate's pretty far down the list. Big cities, little cities. For Moscow, air pollution, 35%. For other big cities, more than 500,000. In Russia is very much an urbanized country. There are the cities, 70% of the population or so, small cities, towns, and village. The cities are in surprisingly good shape. You visit, you'll see it. Countryside, less so. But coming back to the topic here, air pollution is a big deal right across the board. Household waste is a big deal, and it's one of the areas in today where popular politics are in play, where people complain and get action from government. And there's quite a bit of activity on the household waste. The change of climate is way down the list. However, what are the causes of global warming? 67% of the poll, the pollution is caused by human activity. About 25% saying that it's not associated with human activity, that it's a natural process. But it's pretty clear, 67% is a pretty strong number. And another poll covering the same topic, different organization, different poll, about the predominant use of fossil fuels, 38% being slightly concerned, 22 not, or almost not concerned or not concerned. The Russian public is relatively conservative compared to, say, the European EU public on this. They are concerned about global warming, and I actually would suggest that these numbers have begun to shift to greater level of concern after 3 highlighted years of environmental distress inside Russia. But one thing to carry forward, both for Russia and for much of the rest of the world, the attitude to increasing taxes on fossil energy sources, while 22% are neutral, 24 and 25 are negative, that's 49%. That's pretty strong number. So, money is going to matter in this process. Yes, there's a lot of electrification underway. The big traction is going to be in the urban areas, big cities, electrification of bus fleets, of public transportation. There's going to be quite a bit of that. But let's be clear that the real traction behind that is to cut air pollution. If you visit any major European city, you visit any major Russian city, that you can taste the diesel. And this is a big issue for people that live there. These buses are going electric, not because of climate change, but because people are interested in improving air quality. A little bit of a look at the Russian economy. The GDP composition here over in the upper left. Services are approximately 62% of the GDP. About 67% of the Russian workforce works in the service sector. Not a lot different than, it's a developed economy in that sense, very similar structurally like that to Europe or the United States, very, very similar. To pull out, though, the mining sector, the oil and gas, about 10% of the GDP is oil and gas. Russia is much more than an oil well and a gas well. The oil and gas is important to public, to central government funding, but in terms of economic activity, it's moderate. It's moderate. I mean, that's just the deal. And it's very important to Russia's export profile. However, in the last couple years, Russia has reached a fascinating transition point where half of Russia's exports are something other than oil and gas. So the idea that this is a one-song country is not true. And it's really important in this stuff to deal with reality as opposed to narrative. I want to draw attention to the red line here. This is per capita income using the left-hand scale from 1995 to 2020. The 90s were the depths of a catastrophe that's beyond the experience of probably everyone on this call. It was something to behold. However, the Russians pulled themselves together and did it themselves. And the 90s were followed by a decade of pretty strong recovery. The last decade has been less strong. There's some significant economic property rights issues inside Russia that are slowing things down. But the reality is that Russia is a relatively well-to-do country on the global scale of things. The income distribution is pretty steep. You know, the haves really have, and but the urban areas, if you visit them, are surprisingly reconstructed. They're clean for the most part. Very pleasant places to live in a lot of ways. But the resources to set aside for energy transition are limited. The international agreements, the big ones that we know, the Kyoto Protocol from the 90s, ultimately Russia came around to sign that in 2004. They said they would accept the Paris Agreement in 2016 and finally came around to formally doing so just this last October 2020. Now, this graphic here in the lower right, let's see if I can move this over here. These are, sorry, folks. These are national emissions. Forget about the numbers, just realize that emissions have generally been flat. The numbers that do matter over here are on the right. Roughly, Russia is producing about half the emissions that it did in 1990, which for Kyoto and for Paris is a particularly convenient thing. It means that the Russians have already met the needed numbers, if you will, the promised numbers for cutting emissions. They paid in blood, sweat, and tears in the 1990s. And it's kind of maybe not fair, but it is what it is. So they've already made these. They've met the standards for Kyoto and Paris. Russia's got a considerable amount of legislation and it's accelerating. If you're interested in knowing more, you can go to Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. And it's got all the relevant laws and regulations posted. Most of them are in Russian, but they exist, they are real, and you can get quite a bit of information in terms about where things are headed. So taking a quick pass at greenhouse gases in Russia, carbon dioxide is obviously the big one from the consumption of energy. Methane is a biggie, and that is leakage out of the oil and gas sector, coal as well, but oil and gas are the biggies. And for greenhouse gases, you always want to keep in mind things like nitrous oxides and the fluorocarbons, refrigerants, which are very powerful greenhouse gases, far beyond methane, which is far beyond carbon dioxide. Just a little bit of comparison of where Russia fits in on the scale of things. This chart looks at 1970 through 2018. And Russia is the dark blue line. You can see the collapse in the 1990s and kind of a plateau, if you will, rather flat. The real growth action on this chart is twofold. It's the red one, the red line representing China. China's boom last decade was done on the back of coal. And India here, this yellow, I'm going to call it kind of an orange line actually. India is becoming a significant factor in global emissions. And the deal is, you know, this is a global issue. This is not one of those things that you can think globally and act locally on. You got to think globally and you got to act globally. That's just the atmosphere. We have one atmosphere on this planet, and that presents really big social and political and economic problems in terms of how to deal with this. Because it turns out that narrative and wishful thinking will only get you so far and a long way from the final goal. This is a really complicated, but it's a beautiful, beautiful chart. Coming to Russia, here is the purple on the lower left hand. I mean, this covers emissions worldwide. I mean, I can sit and stare at this thing for an hour without any difficulty at all. And I'm always learning something. But on the purple here for Russia, the big deal is electricity and heat and fugitive emissions, which is that methane leakage that I spoke of. So this is at the World Resources Institute. You want to find this graphic, it's out there. So let me move this again. I'm going to blow my mind here. All right, so this is these are methane emissions on the left, upper left-hand graphic. Russia is by far the world's largest methane leaker. It's a serious thing. There's no getting around it. You can't put lipstick on this pig at all. So fugitive emissions are from the drilling and transportation of natural gas. There's a lot of flaring of gas in oil fields in Russia because it's expensive to gather associated gas in such a sprawling place. It's the economics of it are a challenge. But incomplete flaring is not that big of a deal. The venting is much more serious. Part of it is purely intentional. Just we don't want to know, we don't want to collect, and we just let it go. And then there's venting during repairs on pipelines and things like that. So this graphic on the lower right is it's produced from satellite information from the European Space Agency. They've got a satellite up, and there's a company, Kairos, that processes this data. And this is just from earlier this year, looking at two of the big trunk lines that send gas to Europe, also to Russia, but ultimately to Europe. Significant leakage along those pipelines. So quick looking at Russia's domestic energy profile, we'll look at the global profile first, just for a little context. Here over on the left-hand side, in the world, in the whole planetary energy system, natural gas is about 24%. Oil is 33, coal 27. The other renewables, that's wind and solar in particular, is a minor player at this point still. Even after many years of pretty substantial growth, it's only 5%. In the world of oil, about 55% of the world's oil is consumed in transportation, road transportation, air transportation. And while this highlights Norway at 2%, over here on the right, Russia produces about 12% covers about 12% of the global oil demand. And because of weird double counting stuff, the USA, which is a big oil producer, well in excess of what Russia produces, we're also a major exporter of refined products produced from oil that's imported into the United States. It's a long story on that. Looking at Russia specifically, just don't worry about the numbers on the left. Look at the shape of the graphics. And for coal, it's this lower whitish, kind of hard to see on this graphic, overlain by oil, and you can see the collapse of oil and the decline of coal. Also, I mean, the collapse of post-Soviet industry in Russia. You can see it right here. Just tremendous. Coal is plateaued. Russia's the number 3 producer of coal in the world, and coal exports to Asia have become a big thing and are becoming a much bigger thing. High quality coal, certainly much better than most of what is mined in China. There's a bit of arbitrage in that sense, kind of getting rid of the bad and just maybe substituting in the bad. But Russia at the center of things is a economy, a country built on natural gas. It runs on natural gas. It has since way back in the Soviet period. And in that sense, it's from an industrial and from a energy use standpoint, it's a bit light on carbon, if you will. There are a few countries at this scale. I mean, Russia's a leader in terms of the scale of a country dependent on natural gas. The yellow here signifies what's called primary electricity, and in this case, it covers nuclear and hydro. The consumption by sector, and it's just very similar to what you see in the rest of the world. In terms of natural gas relative to what goes on in the rest of the world, down at the bottom, let's work from 2020. The projection for the United States, I believe, is overblown, but it's going to be big. Russia is for real. And then you have Iran, a story not told so much, with Canada and Qatar underneath. Australia with a tremendous amount of production now, number 1, number 2, number 3 in world LNG right now. This is a phenomena of a generation, and then it'll be gone. Looking at Russian gas, total output, these gray portions are what ends up in Europe, basically. These are the export part. About 2/3, 60% or so of gas produced in Russia is used in Russia. Exports are big, and LNG exports have come onto the scene, and Russia's LNG, they're targeting to be the world's largest by the 2030s. We'll see. It's an opportunity. It's realistic in a lot of ways, but it's going to be a road to travel to get there. A lot of countries listed on this. These are the various countries in the world that have some kind of natural gas reserves, and you can see how Russia is the biggest. And there's a lot more exploration that could be done, but just these are proven reserves today, right now. Iran, Qatar, Turkmenistan, the United States. And these include economically, that's what proven reserves are. I mean, they not only exist, but they're economic to recover. So this covers shale in the United States. Kind of a, I don't like graphics that start off halfway up the chart, but this gives you an idea of the collapse in Russia in the 90s and the rebound. And you can see what happened in 2020, which is a terrible year to do any kind of statistical analysis. I mean, basically 2020 is a waste of time. So 2019 is really the last useful reference year on pretty much anything. Okay, you can see domestic oil production in Russia. You can see the collapse of the 90s. Domestic oil consumption, excuse me, a collapse of the 90s, followed by a plateau. As Russia has retooled in terms of its cars and trucks and factories, it's the energy efficiency of that new equipment is substantial. So there are many more cars, there are many more trucks, and there are a lot of retooled commercial and industrial facilities that use oil or oil products, and they are much more efficient. So that efficiency kind of hides the underlying growth, if you will, in the actual equipment platforms. Looking at electricity, so in a lot of the energy transition, that's really happening firstly and foremostly in the world of electricity. Solar power, wind power, it's being treated as somewhat as low-hanging fruit, where you can make changes with a modest number of companies, of entities. You can deal with large scale. You can deal on a large scale relatively quickly. At least you can deal with it. The question is, how quickly can you change something that's being done at a large scale? And it turns out that it's slow. That's just that's one of the consequences of dealing with large things. But Russia is the number 4 producer of electricity in the world, having not so recently been passed by India. But you can see with China continues to leap ahead in total electricity production, way ahead of everybody. In Russia, you can see the role of gas in producing electricity, 47%. Coal, roughly 16%. Nuclear is now up to 19%. Hydro is big, 17%. And renewables, call it wind, solar, and geothermal. I mean, they really struggle to get to this 1% figure. But thinking broadly in terms of carbon, around 36% of Russia's electricity currently today is no or very low carbon. And then there's the gas portion of it. Coal is fading. Much of the the coal burning power plants are older. Russia is preferring to gasify wherever possible and move away from coal. The real movement for Russian coal now is movement abroad to Asia, to China. Kind of a complicated graphic here. You can see Russia is the second row on this list, and you can see the different regions of the world, and you can see how Russia compares. I'm gonna kill this mouse. So green is gas, and Russia is very much a gasified economy in terms of electricity. You can see the United States here, number 4 as well. But you can see China and India are very coal centric, and renewables are appearing, and the Chinese are building tremendous amounts of renewables, and the renewable build out in India gets a lot of press, but we're going to have to deal in facts rather than narratives here, and this is going to be a tough road. Part of the crisis that's going on now in Europe and all, the gas crisis, it turns out that there's a drought in Brazil, and the Brazilians are taking about 4 million tons of LNG that were not figured to go to Brazil this year. So that was an unexpected development and a list of unexpected developments that have resulted in Europe's crisis. So it's overdependence on any one particular category presents issues, and that includes renewables, by the way. Like looking at electricity prices in Russia, we want to use the US dollar. That makes sense to pretty much most of the people on this call, at least. Household is 6 cents a kilowatt hour. I'm pulling I don't know where you live, but here in San Diego, we're during peak time, we're paying 62 cents a kilowatt hour. And supposedly in super off peak, just to get the electricity to the house, the delivery cost is 24 cents a kilowatt hour. It doesn't matter whether it's on peak or off. And super off peak is 6 cents a kilowatt hour. So even in the super off peak here in San Diego, we are paying 30 cents a kilowatt hour. In Europe, these are the 20 most expensive markets in the world for electricity. This is from earlier this year. I mean, all this data is as fresh as I can get it, and almost all of it's 2021. This is from March. Germany at 37 cents, Denmark, Belgium at 30 cents, UK at 27, Japan at 24, Austria, Spain. So electricity is expensive in Europe. It's not expensive in Russia. It depends on where you are in the United States, whether it's expensive. It's freaky expensive here in California. There are huge implications from that we've been able to somehow avoid talking about. Nuclear power is a significant player in Russian electricity. As I mentioned earlier, about 19% of production. There are 10 sites in Russia, a total of 31 reactors. The technology is good. The operational reliability is very high. Please set aside the Chernobyl catastrophe. It's a study in how not to operate anything. It was really an extraordinary thing. I'm no big fan of pressurized water reactor technology, but I'll tell you that Russia, the Russian public is very comfortable with nuclear power. I'm sorry I didn't put any stats in it, but 50% of the public support moving forward with nuclear power in Russia. That about that range of people, 50% or so, believe that they consider it green. Russians take a great deal of pride in their indigenous technological capabilities. And in that sense, there's some, they share some of that with the United States, where technologies really are, uh, that's who we are in a lot of ways. But nuclear power has a future in Russia. It remains to be seen. What's interesting in terms of the nuclear sector in particular is the use of what we have here is a floating reactor. Russia has an icebreaker fleet, a nuclear powered icebreaker fleet. The US Navy has nuclear powered submarines and cruisers, carriers. Russia has nuclear powered icebreakers. And there are two 35 megawatt reactors on this barge, basically. These are reactors that would otherwise be in a nuclear powered icebreaker. And there's a whole new generation of icebreakers being put out in Russia now. Rosatom is the provider of the reactor technology. And the idea that they will use small modular, essentially these are small modular systems. And this one is docked in Chukotka at the most northern port in the world. And it's there are plans to install a number of these to supply mines and small related communities in that unpopulated area of Siberia. And those communities are currently served either by coal hauled in incredible distances at great price or by diesel. And the thought is that they can cut the cost of power by about half. All right. So just going to look quick here. Siberia is not a windy place. It's a big country. The wind does blow on the seacoast in the north. The wind blows on the seacoast in the east. I can tell you the wind blows on the seacoast in the east. But very few people live here. And even if you generate a significant amount of electricity in these zones, to get it to urban centers would be fantastically expensive. So there are real limitations to what renewables will do in a concrete sense in Russia. There will have its place, but the idea that Russia will be repowered on solar and wind is just it's not going to happen. All right, so sorry for that interruption. So currently less than 1% of electricity is generated through non-hydro renewables. There are optimistic plans that have come to very slow fruition. Let's be clear about that. One of the big challenges for renewables in Russia is that the traditional management of electric power in Russia is to have 100% backup facilities for renewable based power. This is super conservative, but it is what it is. It's the issue of the intermittency of wind and solar has been highlighted in this year's electricity crisis, gas crisis in Europe. I mean, it's the number one factor. Has been the wind drought in the North Sea in Northern Europe. Blows my mind that it doesn't, that the politics are running ahead of what's actually taking place. The last line here is an important one. The lack of social demand to build a green energy future makes the process extremely vulnerable to an unstable economic situation. Russia is oversupplied in terms of generation capacity for electricity. Any new capacity will have to substitute for existing, and that costs money to send away capacity that's built but is not being used. There is a Russia Renewable Energy Development Association. It's got some very serious people with it. The Finnish group Fortune is the most active player in the Russian wind market, period. They've got several large projects, and they actually have the lion's share of wind generation capacity in Russia today. Blue hydrogen is something that could be produced from natural gas, where the carbon dioxide is sequestered. This is a big opportunity potentially for Russia in the future. There really remains an awful lot of question about whether hydrogen is for real. It's a great talking story, but there's a lot of energy that's lost in getting to hydrogen and then back out of hydrogen into the hands of consumers. One of the areas, though, where hydrogen of any kind can be helpful to the emissions issue is the production of ammonia and using ammonia as a fuel, particularly in shipping. This is a real challenging area to decarbonize. Ammonia offers some very interesting opportunities there. In order to do a lot of this, well, I'm running out of time here. So there is a nascent carbon market coming on in Sakhalin Island in the far east of Russia. It's nascent is the key word here. It's really not operating. And in order for Russia to really participate in the market side of decarbonization, they're going to need to be able to price carbon somehow. That's going to be a big factor going forward. This carbon border adjustment mechanism is really, really important. Russia is a large trading partner for Europe, particularly at the natural resource level. Europe is a very important trading partner for Russia. China has crept in there to be number 2 or number 1. I couldn't tell you exactly now, but Europe is big time. And from the European perspective, about 20% of their domestic carbon dioxide emissions come from imported goods and services. So they're wanting to get a handle on that. They don't want to see European industry leave and go to places where there's no carbon policy. So they have issued this carbon border adjustment mechanism this summer. It's based on their emissions trading system, which is the most active emissions trading system going right now. It is very important. I would say it's far more relevant than what's going on in California, although California gets a lot of references. There's a lot of action going on in Europe built around this ETS system. Lots of opportunities for bureaucracy to come into play here with the certification of whether imports have met a CBAM standard. There will be a transition period up to 2035. But from the Russian standpoint, since the cross-border adjustment mechanism is going to apply to cement, iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizers, electricity. These are all big items for Russian export. Russian companies stand to be significant losers on this. They are very concerned about how they will be affected by it. There are the economics, which I think companies can get their arms around. The politics of it are a little more dicey because of the plans by the EU, and it's something that's talked about a lot here in the United States, to use emissions taxes to cut taxes elsewhere. So Russians are very much unthrilled by the idea to be paying more to fund European social programs or government programs of any kind. This is a big issue, and this carbon border adjustment mechanism affects not just Russia, it affects the world. This is how Europe is dealing with the world in trade through the glass of emissions reduction. And as noted here on the last line here, on March 5th, the World Trade Organization has launched a Trade and Environmental Sustainability Joint Initiative Group, 53 member countries. They're going to try to shake this all out. But I will tell you, this is an opportunity for protectionism of the first order. And what used to be protectionism has now become politicized at every turn. Everything has become politicized. There's real initiatives inside Russia to deal with green aviation. This is a serious proposal to come with green aviation fuel that meets international standards. Rusal is restructured their company. Most Russian aluminum is produced using hydropower, and they have restructured their company to base their aluminum production on green electricity, if you will. They look to be a dominant player in the world of aluminum in the 21st century on this basis. Some takeaways here. The deal is that the global energy transition is not going to be easy. It's going to be really challenging in Russia. Remember, this place is way north. Solar power might be a decent resource, and I know people in the solar business in Russia selling into the dacha community. It works great in the summertime when you got long days. It really doesn't work very well in the winter, the part of the year when days are very, very short. You have deep cold. And while we talk about global warming, the reality is the winter continues every year in Russia. Economics matter. It's really important that this transition drive costs down. That's where it will be easier to do this. By driving costs up, is going to make it tougher politically, especially for people that don't have money to burn, if you will. Economics are going to interfere with an environmental policy. Anti-pollution narratives are going to create the strongest buy-in from Russians. And it's the case throughout most of the world. In China, in the developing world, it's pollution that's the driver. Electricity is a high technology product, and we want to pursue electrification wherever possible, and by driving down the cost of electricity makes that an easier process. For the Russians, they're going to continue with gas and nuclear at home. There's just a very limited future for solar and a limited future for wind. They're going to do much more wind than they do today, but we're talking about decarbonization. We're talking about a massive transition, and carving at a problem around the edges may help that narrative for a little while, but it's not going to solve any problems. Real question: is there a future for hydrogen? This is a big question in the world of energy, and it's still. I mean, it's used today to produce fertilizer through ammonia. It's used in petrochemical industry, but to roll out hydrogen into the world, probably the lowest hanging fruit, if you will be to generate electricity. And other uses are going to require retooling of everything. That this is to discuss hydrogen. It's all about physics and engineering. I mean, that's what energy is about, and that's when you're going to have solutions, as when you're dealing with it in that way. For Russia to deal with this global energy transition, but also deal with decarbonization, the reduction of emissions, which is crucial from getting from today to where we want to get in the future. The lowest hanging fruit in Russia is to reduce the methane emissions. So it's a ton of material. Thank you all very much for being patient. I'll take any questions for those that are still on the call. Thank you.
David, this was fascinating, just a very comprehensive and helpful overview, fascinating, insightful. It's interesting to me, some of many of the problems you mentioned, our company's working on that, and I'm wondering if this is an opportunity for us to introduce it to Russia. Our company's a company called Expansive. We're the largest global online exchange for carbon offsets. So you asked the question, we need to put a price on carbon. That's exactly what we've done. You mentioned the CORSIA framework. That's the framework that was developed by the airlines on quantifying, standardizing carbon emissions. We took that framework and came up with a product called GEO, which is a global emission offset. And the GEO we traded on the spot on our exchange, and CME, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, trades futures on that. So there is a price on carbon. You can use that today. I think it's at $6 or $7 a ton of emissions. It was a year ago at 80 cents. So I think the world is waking up to exactly what you're saying, which is carbon emissions have a higher economic cost than we thought. We currently provide that in Europe. We do not have a presence in Russia, but seems to me like it would be a great solution for Russian government and Russian companies, one, to purchase carbon offsets, but also to monetize some of their positive attributes. So there's a product that we just came up with. You mentioned reducing methane emissions. The product we came up with is called MPC, Methane Performance Certificate. So if I produce natural gas and my methane emissions are low, I can get a methane performance certificate that validates that, and then I can sell that methane performance certificate as a way to get credit, to monetize my positive environmental behavior, if you will. So it's a way to drive companies to reduce their methane performance, and for market forces to put a price on value on that. So in as much as there's natural gas production in Russia that has low methane performance, it could benefit from that. And it would be a way for Russian companies, Russian government to generate some positive revenue in addition to revenue they get from selling that. So that would make the economics of natural gas more attractive, economics of nuclear more attractive, economics of wind or solar more attractive. So that's kind of the product that this exchange we've seen as a way to try to give economic forces to drive that behavior. We haven't actively gone after the Russian market. We are in Europe, and we are very large in US and Australia. What I don't know is how it would be perceived and received in Russia, particularly since it's, as you said, fairly politicized.
Well, you're approaching it from an economic standpoint. And in that instance, you're kind of letting the chips fall where they may. Yeah, there's regulatory regimes and environments. But if you're able to quantify, monetize. I mean, the Russians are on board to getting there. And the airline industry, I would say, would be your first avenue, your entry. Aeroflot's a serious airline. There are a lot of airlines that are going to pass through Russia. You have fuel markets for airline refueling. And then for gas, yeah, I very fascinating what you're doing. I mean, it's, so you can tell I'll be digging into some of the pathways here that you've been walking on, and in the hours and days to come. Yeah, there's real opportunities here. You know, ways to make it economically worthwhile. I mean, the reality is, to do this global energy transition, we are going to need to use the infrastructure that we have now. That's the economic system, the companies that live within it, the consumers that interact with those companies. That will be the way in which we're able to deal with this problem at the scale that we need to. So I congratulate you in being in on a really fascinating, cutting edge place. To be continued.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. I apologize. We want to open it up for questions. I know we're a little over, but I didn't.
I'm not. I'm here. So you know, I ran long, so you know, I'm willing to stick around here for a while. I know that John had wanted to talk about Nord Stream and all that.
There was a question in the chat room. Let me mention
okay.
to you.
Yeah.
Someone said, "Do you think Russia is holding back gas to Europe currently?"
So Russia had a cold winter, like pretty much everyone else in the northern hemisphere. Epic in places. In the Far East, super epic. They had a chilly spring. They had heat waves during the summer. Russia depends on seasonal storage of gas, just like we do in the United States, just like in Western Europe. Because of the poor weather, Russia was slow at rebuilding their domestic storage. Coming into the end of August, Russia was down about 35 billion cubic meters in storage, which is about 10% of their annual consumption. It's a big number, period. And that is, as I mentioned earlier, the third rail of Russian politics is preparations for winter. You don't mess with that. You mess with that, you lose your job or more. And this is hundreds of years old. And the guys in the Kremlin know this absolutely. And they sure know it in Gazprom, where if you play around, you could lose everything. So Gazprom's first order was to refill Russian storage. And that's what's been taking place the last couple months. Russian supplies into Western Europe have met all existing contracts. And in fact, the Russians have pulled down their storage in Western Europe to help balance all this in terms of supplying contracts, but also give them a little flexibility of dealing with the domestic situation. Now that the storage is coming near full in Russia, you will see expanded gas flows. Up to this point, this has been year number 2. The record flow was in 2018 or 19. And so far the flows to Europe are just slightly less than that. But coming here at this year will finish strong. The politics on this are really amazing. And I participated this summer in the discussion of why what's going on in Europe's gas, and what's going on in Russia. And I will tell you that in the industry pros, Bloomberg, S&P Platts, Reuters, they didn't know. Uh, you know, people didn't know what the storage situation was in Russia. So that's a biggie. There has not been a holdback. The biggest complaint that I have on the Russians is that Gazprom has done a crappy job of keeping the markets informed about the situation that they were facing and how they were dealing with it. And that's really unfortunate. It is what it is. It's interesting though that when that the last a couple of weeks ago now, when Putin made his announcement, that broke the fever in the markets. I mean, the spike in gas prices moved into another universe. It became a speculative race. This was not about gas. This was about speculation. And the best way to deal with speculation is to jawbone, and that does change the risk equation for speculators. And it turns out that prices are now off by half. They've dropped by half from that peak a couple weeks ago. Long answer to a short question. Let me extend this a little further. The big issue for Europe and for all of us on this call is, okay, so wind and solar have intermittency issues. For solar, it's that the sun sets, and you can deal with that with batteries at some point, some sort of battery storage that allows you to deal with this night and day flex. Same thing for wind. The wind comes and goes. Texas has got a great example of how that all works. Sometimes it blows really hard, sometimes it doesn't blow so much. The guys that have built out the windmill infrastructure in Northern Europe, they've done their homework. They know statistically what to expect from the output of their windmill farms. There are times, though, when the weather does not cooperate for extended periods of time. And this has been a terrible year for wind in the Northern Europe. You look at the financial reporting from German utilities, from Danish, you look at Britain as well. This has been a terrible year for wind. And that has been compensated by a greater gas burn. And that is the single biggest factor in this whole thing, has been the wind drought in Northern Europe and the need to do a gas burn to compensate to keep the lights on. This drought, and this is something that we're going to talk about on the Western Regional Partnership, whether people here in California want to talk about it or not. There is no way, there's no battery technology to compensate for that kind of drought. Imagine building a backup storage system fully charged that will supply 20, 30, 40. If you're totally dependent on wind, imagine you're going to set this aside and use it every couple of years, maybe once a decade, maybe once every other decade. For UK, this has been since 1960, this has been the least windy year. So the cost to finance and build and charge that backup that you're going to only use once every few years or a couple decades, no. So we got a problem. And but the response so far out of Europe is, well, we're just going to drive faster into the swamp. And I just we got some problems. We have big problems to fix, and they are going to require serious answers. Mother Nature's unforgiving on this. You know, she doesn't care about the narrative or the politics. Anyhow. And go ahead.
David, I think we've gone over on time, so I'm going to ask if we could wrap it up. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. This was such a fascinating subject, and I think you covered it so well. We recorded this. I hope that's okay with you, the recorded, and then we will share the recording with everyone who registered and who wasn't able to attend. So we'll have it, because I thought you had so many great slides and graphs in there. I'd love to take a deeper look at some of those. So really, really appreciate it. Just fascinating. Yeah. Really, really large, important topic. And I thought you did a great job trying to give us a picture of it. So thank you.
Thank you.